Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to the crowds, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed in the land, and would sleep and rise night and day, and through it all the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. Or of its own accord the land yields fruit, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest has come." He said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed that, when it is sown in the ground, it is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it's sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Without parables he did not speak to them, but to his own disciples he explained everything in private. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Anybody here know who Rita Rizzo is? Have you ever heard of her? Sorry? Mother Angelica, that's right. So, Mother Angelica was born in poverty, impoverishment in her whole young life. And when she was 21, she decided to become a nun. So she entered the Poor Clares, which is a Franciscan order. And there she felt that God was calling her to a very special ministry, one that no other female or sister was involved in up till that point in time. She felt called to the television ministry. So with $200 and a few other sisters, she embarked on her project, the first one to have her own television network. Now, she admits she knew absolutely nothing about television. Well, she could turn it on, she said. That was about it. But she built a monastery, she moved to Alabama, and there she opened the EWTN television network. And of course, today, you can find EWTN in most countries in the world. She died in 2006, I think. She was paralyzed for many, many years. But she did continue to do her recordings, and her recordings and messages and instructions are still played twice a day, 7/24. And so you see, the seed that Mother Angelica sowed sprouted and bore much, much fruit. In 1895, a young man growing up in Switzerland, right across the border from Italy, and one morning he woke up and he could hear this commotion outside his window. And on further investigation, people had gathered. And the news that they had was war had broken out in Italy. So he went home, packed his bags, and decided to investigate the matter for himself. So he crossed the border into Italy, into the town of Castiglione. And there he heard the shots and the screaming and people dying and so from their wounds. That night he went into town and he tried to find as many helpers as possible to go the next day to take care of the soldiers and the wounded and so on, which he did. all people, farmers and shopkeepers, you name it, they accompanied him to outside Castiglione in the mountains. That evening, when it was all over, he decided to go back to Switzerland, where he came from. But he wrote down the terrible and horrible situation in which he found the soldiers wounded, their screams and so on. And then he suggested that every country should have some kind of relief assistance for times of war and emergencies. 5 years later, back in Geneva, the first volunteer project was established. And you know what they called it? The Red Cross. The Red Cross. 5 years later, he was the very first man to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And the seed that he sowed that day now has spread throughout the world, so that you find the Red Cross wherever there are earthquakes, wherever there are tragedies. The Red Cross is always there. And so you see that what begins small, tiny seeds, very often flower and fructify and bear much fruit. The same is true of the church. Started off in a small room in Jerusalem with 120 disciples. Today, there are millions of Jesus' disciples. But I think the question that you and I ought to ask ourselves this evening is, what kind of seeds am I sowing in my life? You think about that. Because we're all sowing seeds of one kind or another, good and bad. So do we sow seeds of generosity, of compassion, forgiveness, mercy? Do we affirm people? Do we forgive them? Do we reach out to help the poor and the naked and the homeless? What kind of seeds am I sowing? What kind of seeds are you sowing? Maybe it's seeds of anger, unforgiveness. Maybe it's bigotry, discrimination, injustice. That's the other kind of seed that we can sow in our lives. So it's very, very important, the kind of seeds that we grow. I celebrate a lot of funerals. And I usually talk to the family beforehand, a few days before, and I suggest always that one of the family or friends pay a tribute to their deceased loved one. That's important, you do that. So it's very interesting for me to listen to what people say about their loved ones. And I remember particularly one thing when a son gets up and talks about his father, which is appropriate, of course, on Father's Weekend. He will tell the people and me that his father was always there for him. Always. Attending his baseball games, football games, whatever. He was always there for him. And that seems to me to be one of the most important things that any father can do. Going on the things I hear from sons who've lost their father, it seems to be the most important thing, that the father is always there in good times and in bad. So this evening, let us think about the seeds we are sowing. Because you know, we are all sowing seeds. So let us not miss the opportunities that come our way every day to sow good seeds. Stephen Grellet was born in Limoges outside Paris. And Limoges is one of the most famous small towns in France. There is a special kind of cutlery and so on that's made there. So Stephen Grelet was born there, became a missionary. And on one occasion, he said this: "I expect to pass this way but once. If, therefore, there is any kindness I can show, or any good thing I can do to my fellow human beings, let me do it now. Let me do it now, and not defer or neglect it, because I shall pass this way. I shall not pass this way again." That really sums up the meaning of today's gospel. We get one shot, just one, so we better make use of that opportunity, so that when somebody stands up at my funeral and your funeral, they will have something positive to say about us. In other words, let me put it this way. When my name comes up in conversation, what is the first thing that people think about me? When your name comes up in conversation, what is the first thing that comes to mind to your neighbors and friends and parishioners? That's a very, very good question to ask ourselves this evening, because the answer will make an awful difference to those people who know us and love us.